Welcome to the second in the series of CISO Connections. It's an absolute pleasure to be here hosting the webinar again. I'm absolutely delighted that we have got one of Checkpoint's global CISOs, Pete Nicoletti, here. And today we're going to be talking about cyber resilience. It'd be great if you could do some quick introductions, Pete, who you are, some of the highlights as to where you've worked, etc.
Absolutely, Deryck. Great to be here. Sorry I wasn't on the first one, but the second one I'll jump on. So yeah, Deryck. So I've been in IT for about 32 years now. So at about 21 or 22 of those years at the CISO level. I've done 2 Fortune 100 stints as a CISO. So I have the arrows in my back and the sleepless nights and the close to divorce level events. But I worked at Hertz for a couple of years, and Verizon for a couple of years, and Dell and RSA and some others. And I've done 2 clouds all the way to FedRAMP. And for about 8 or 9 years, I did a lot of incident response. So I was incident commander for about 120 different incidents. So I've seen a lot of, easy work, preparing, a program, as well as the hard work of, when somebody's program fails and having to go in and mop up the messes really quickly. So, and my career started because my father-in-law's company was hacked, and I went down the rabbit hole trying to figure out what was going on. I was basically just a network guy. I was a router and a wireless and a LAN and a WAN guy, frame relay and all that kind of stuff. But the security stuff really interested me to the point where I started a MSSP, and I sold that one, started another one, and I've been involved in 4 different MSSPs. So managing the security for hundreds and if not thousands of companies. I've seen a wide variety of maturity of security programs out there, and that's why this topic is really of interest to me, Deryck.
Yeah. So a man on a mission. You started in cyber as your father got hacked. That's what I like to hear, Pete. Somebody that's coming in to make a real difference. Pete, if I was to offer you a definition for cyber resiliency, because I think that's at the heart of everything we're here to do. This is the one that comes from NIST. So NIST talk about the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromises on systems that use or are enabled by cyber resources. I think that's a really strong, great definition of what cyber resiliency actually is. What does cyber resiliency mean to you when you were working as a commercial operational CISO, Pete?
I think it means 2 things, and that's a great start, Deryck. The 2 things it means to me is that you're resilient enough to run your operations in normal times. And normal times meaning you're attacked constantly, but you also have the resiliency to withstand increased demand. Whether it's through websites or whether it's through updating, whether it's through customers, or whether it's through DDoS. That's the first phase of cyber resiliency in my book. The second phase is assuming that you get breached. How cyber resilient are you in a post-event issue? So there's the prepared side or the preparedness side, but then there's also the side where, and here's the thing, we all know we should be preparing for being breached because nobody's perfect. And every system that we design and humans design has back doors to it and whatnot. In fact, Deryck, when I was doing pen tests, I did physical break-ins and network break-ins, and I was 100% successful over about 60 different times. So all it takes is enough money and enough time and sometimes luck to break into a company. And we keep seeing that, even the checkpoint research and the mid-year report shows that not only are attacks up, but successful breaches are up. So cyber resilience really needs to be thought of, as a very critical part of your security program. A lot of people think of the security program as just the static defenses, but they don't really think of the scalability that's required for cyber resilience, and they don't really consider that post break-in part of cyber resilience, Deryck.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. What fascinates me when we talk about resilience, Pete, is I know several boards across here in the UK who have been breached, and every single board that has been breached, every single board actually thought they were in a position where they were resilient. They thought they had a level of compliance that could be with some of the frameworks, such as Cyber Essentials across here in the UK, or they could be part of national infrastructure, whereby again they're getting assessed for a level of maturity. And every single case, when the breach happened, they didn't actually realise they had an issue. So it wasn't something that they could risk assess at the board level. I guess it was two things in there, Pete. One, the board was either unaware of the level of risk, or they were unaware of the level of cyber resilience they had or didn't have. Or two, potentially it was the communications up, or it was the use of a dashboard that didn't have the right metrics on it, etc. Keen again to dip back into your career, Pete. How did you talk to the board around levels of maturity and resilience? Were they asking you to risk assess? Does it start with risk? Does it start with working at frameworks? I'm assuming they don't want a big fancy dashboard that's got fancy flashing lights everywhere. That's the world we don't want to be in. But can you get your context, Pete?
Yeah, sure. I suspect that those boards that were surprised were looking at their security from compliance framework check marks. Number one. Number two, I sincerely doubt that they were involved in their, tabletop exercises that specifically focused on cyber resiliency. And the way that I got the last couple of boards that I've been, presenting to be involved in cyber resiliency is that I did involve them in the quarterly tests, and I would always throw a monkey wrench into the tests to demonstrate, were we cyber resilient or were we not? And to the point of things like, a lot of companies don't think about when they're hacked, what subsystems are affected. When somebody clicks on ransomware and all of a sudden it's going east and west and servers that are not patched get compromised and encrypted. Well, think about, it might not just be the front public facing websites that are offline, but also your voice over IP systems and also your internal email. So to demonstrate cyber resilience is to prove that multiple subsystems are protected from, a breach and are not affected in universal, mass. One small breach should not lead to a catastrophic event, just like we saw, 2 weeks ago at MGM, where we saw, a breach, but it led to a catastrophe, and they had to shut off elevators and food service and shows, and their revenue was affected by millions and their stock was affected by millions. And if they had looked a little bit further past the checkmark, compliance type program to a cyber resilient program, they would have really had their, for example, their zero trust strategy a little bit further along. They would have had micro segmentation further along. They would have had a much more resilient authentication program. They had a singular authentication program that once a person with God level privileges came in, it was game over. So really looking at resilience throughout all of your different subsystems to prevent those catastrophic events, but then bringing it to the board level, because guess what? Cyber resilience costs extra money. But what we're consistently seeing, especially in those industries that have a high revenue loss per minute, like, for example, When I was at the CISO at Hertz, it was $19,000 a minute. And we would have these conversations with our vendors and with our program, with our board, and we would say, look, we can't have an outage, and we need to be resilient against an outage, because our revenue per minute and the and the inefficiencies and having to go to paperwork versus online and processing credit cards, it became such a huge, we figured just like an incident costs 100 more than a standard program, cyber resilience, failure of cyber resilience costs 100 more than a good cyber resilient program.
Yeah, I think that's a strong point, because I firmly believe that the MGM board would have invested more if the level of cyber risk had been articulated to the point that they understand, one, the probability of an incident, and two, the impact of that incident. So again, we are still talking about trying to talk about business language here, talking about cyber risk that boards understand, so that the boards can actually make the right decisions as to where they invest and what they should be doing, etc. Well, what's the 2 or 3 top things you think the learnings are from the MGM? I mean, other than clearly articulating that level of risk, what do you think MGM should have done better or should have done different, Pete?
Well, it may be, what happens is sometimes cybersecurity professionals are too close to it, and they may not, now this is just guessing, but they may not have had third parties coming in specifically looking at cyber resiliency. I'm sure they had pen tests and vulnerability tests, and they were scanning and for vulnerabilities and whatnot. But a cyber resilience test, for example, one of the things, there's 2 or 3 different recommendations in this area that we should probably make. And the first one is MITRE. MITRE, of course, has the ATT and CK framework that, of course, Checkpoint adheres to with their, showing their vulnerabilities and how we have compensating controls for it. Well, MITRE also developed a cyber resiliency engineering framework navigator, which, and we'll put it up on the screen right now. It's a free visualization tool, and it enables customers to customize their goals, their objectives, and their techniques. And when you start filling that out, it becomes very apparent what your shortcomings are and where your strengths are. And then once those shortcomings are explained as, hey, here's a risk to the business, here's an area that we need more funding, or we need more personnel, or we need more focus, that's when the board, that's when an educated board will make the decision once you explain that risk to them. CISOs are very, very good at identifying risk. And typically it's risk in a strict cybersecurity framework. Now, larger companies and smarter companies really have to expand those risk areas to cover cyber resiliency. And so that framework gives a good, here's the thing. Most boards, when a CISO says something, they're like, yeah, whatever. But when a third party says something that validates what the CISO says, all of a sudden, oh yeah, I guess we need to do something about that. So that's what these frameworks do. The other one that we should probably mention is NIST 800-160 V2, which is a little bit more of a technical document. It's a security engineering approach, and it really digs into a lot more of the deeper technical requirements to be able to anticipate and withstand and recover from adverse conditions and stresses and compromises. So I'm quoting what the document covers, and it really is a much deeper document. And once again, that will expose risk, and then that's when you can have those discussions with the board saying, hey, look, we're a company that does NIST 853. Now we need to, and we've met those standards, or ISO, 27,000. But in the cyber resiliency world, that's where we need to look at 800, 160 and start looking at where we have strengths and where we have weaknesses, and then bringing those risks to the board, having the budgetary discussions, the prioritization discussions, because cybersecurity should enable the business. It shouldn't slow down the business. But for CISOs, we really need to bring those risks to the board, make sure we have those deep discussions, and be able to prioritize what our program should cover.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're talking about there is what we would normally call resilience engineering, where you're actually developing or you're securing every one of your architectural artifacts so that every single component has actually got resilience securely built into or designed into it, so that you can absorb any individual incident or any individual failure, and the business still continue.
Deryck, that brings up a good point. Right now we're really talking about cyber resiliency just strictly within a security framework, but the point that you bring up is critical as well. Businesses outsource their websites, they outsource their customer relationship management tools, they outsource their hosting of their business information systems to SAP or Salesforce. So to truly be cyber resilient, those SASE applications need to be quantified as far as how cyber resilient they are as well. Are they using multi-zones if they're hosted in Amazons? Do they, how many sessions can they handle in the case of a flood? And then, are those companies able to deal with some of these record-setting DDoS attacks that we're seeing? So it's not just the security program, although this is 99% of our conversation today, but those outsourced tools and those third-party tools really need to be assessed for their cyber resiliency as well.
So how do you go about assessing supply chain resilience, Pete? It's one thing when we've got the problem ourselves we're trying to fix, which is big enough, and then you're absolutely right. You outsource, you buy, you procure a service, and you're looking to procure a service which you're hoping is resilient. You're hoping it is secure, but yeah, from what you're saying, it's not always. So how do you go about assessing that? Assessing the security, the maturity levels, how resilient these tools are. What would you go about doing?
Well, in the security world, shared assessments and those types of surveys where you ask the vendor to supply their security framework and their compliance standards, those need to be expanded to ask, how are they addressing, 800, 160? So, and also if they've gone through the MITRE compliance to the resiliency. And, a lot of them are, because they're hosting multiple customers.
Yeah.
And the sophisticated customers are asking these kind of questions. And because what they're going to say is, look, we're hosting 1,000 customers. Not all of our customers are going to be overwhelmed at once. Maybe just you are, or just one or two. And we have enough capacity to be able to deal with those types of an onslaught. Then the secondary, as I explained at the top of the hour, if they are compromised, how resilient are they to maintaining operations? So, for some of your strategic relationships with, this is going to be a long conversation, and it's going to take verification. It's going to take not just questionnaires, but also, going deep under NDA and looking at, the engineering and the capacity planning that they have and the resilience plans, and then perhaps even including them in your tabletop exercises to see how they deal with it. For example, back to that tabletop exercise where I said our voice over IP systems failed. Well, what if their voice over IP systems failed and you can't talk to them? Do you have their cell phone numbers? Do you have their personal email so that you can actually, communicate to them out of band if they're compromised? We've seen multiple cases where there's been companies that were overwhelmed with an attack, and their management backbone, where they were, all their logs were, occurring, millions per second, and their management backbone, could not be accessed. And how do you deal with that? You have to send an engineer into the data center and plug into the actual server. So having an understanding of how resilient that your partners are, I think, is just as important to how resilient your own internal systems are.
Yeah, great. I'm going to pivot slightly, Pete. I'm going to look at, I was interested earlier in the year, the World Economic Forum was warning about the level of geopolitical instability. And what they were saying is that this could well lead to some sort of catastrophic cyber incident or a next generation type attack that really does damage services on a global scale, not on a localized scale. I mean, obviously, even since they published that report back in January 2023,
Right.
It's clear to me that the instability is probably in as bad a place as it's been for many, many decades. And this is not just with the wars that we're seeing at the moment, but we've also got commercial instability as well. We've got instability of things like oil prices that seem to be going up. As always, diesel petrol across here in the UK is only going one direction again at the moment as well. Just can you get your thoughts on what you're seeing, how you're seeing that impact? Is it DDoS? Is it hacktivists? Is it nation states that we're actually seeing at the moment? Is it a combination of them all, whereby potentially DDoS is distraction as they're actually coming in through some of the vulnerabilities or backdoors?
Yeah, so Deryck, you're listing out all the things that we should be worried about and we should have plans for. Depending on the company and depending on what you provide as a service, if you're a hospital and you're trying to maintain life and save people, your priorities are a lot different than if you're, a paper manufacturer and your line goes down for a day or two. So, pardon me, depending on what your business is, we need to be prepared for a number of things, whether it be, electromagnetic bombs going off that knock off our power generation. Do we have generators that, in the case of a hospital, that's going to kick on? We also know that the United States, we joke about it quite a bit, in after a beer or two at the pub, but we have the kill switch. We could actually break connections to the rest of the world if necessary. So what happens in those cases to some companies? Do they just lose some international companies or customers, or do they lose connectivity to some of their key subsystems that may be hosted in London if they're a financial company, or hosted in Germany if they're working with SAP? So looking at each one of those, geopolitical risks, whether it be the DDoS attacks, the hacktivism, we need to be able to look at, depending on what our business is, how we're going to deal with those worst case scenarios. Because up until a few weeks ago, those worst case scenarios were a little bit, theoretical. Now, what we're seeing with wars on two fronts, we are seeing localized hacktivism, but in our predictions, which are being released this week, the CISO predictions paper from Checkpoint, we're actually going to see an increase in hacktivism. We're going to see an increase in artificial intelligence-based threats, both in hyper-targeted automatic phishing generation, as well as, and good English. It's no longer the Nigerian scam. And we're also going to see AI threats that are, code created, because the hackers are not using ChatGPT that has the safe guardrails. They're building their own systems. They're renting them out to each other, and they're able to create 0 days and threats that we haven't seen before. So all of those threats that you listed off there at the top of the question, we actually have to put into our consideration and make sure that our cybersecurity program, as well as our resilience program, addresses those appropriate to our business, because every business is different.
Yeah, sure. And you did touch on AI there, which I was keen to get into as well with Pete. We are starting to see AI threats. We know there was a large business email compromise attack earlier in the year that was $35 million that was paid out. It's definitely starting to increase, I think, the success rates of things like the large multi-vector DDoS attacks, etc. But surely as well, we need to be now turning to AI to say AI can also help us with our offensive.
Yep.
War on cyber at the moment, which is we're not going to be able to cope with. You already talked about the management backplane and the amount of data. We're not in a world that we're going to keep being able to scale up our back-end systems, scale up our SOC and our SIEM. We've got capacity issues already with engineering talent. Are we now at the point where AI actually is no longer part of the answer, but AI actually is it the big thing we're looking to take us forward now?
Oh, it's absolutely mandatory. And there's a couple aspects of AI, and I've been tracking on this quite a bit, doing the voice cloning and the video fakes and the photo fakes. And, I like to say we live in a post-real society, Deryck, where you can't trust, I promise you, this is a human talking, but it could be an AI head, speaking just as well, because right now, ChatGPT has an IQ of 155. It passes the bar, the law bar. It passes the SAT. So we know the capacity for the bad guys to use AI. But as you started to mention, you have to bring a bigger gun, a bigger AI gun to the AI gunfight. And that's something that Checkpoint, and there's two aspects of that really are critical. It's not just enough to say that you have artificial intelligence engines looking for new threats. That's not good enough. The bigger part of it is how quickly do you recognize those and can enable and protect and prevent those issues from occurring at your customer sites. And that's where, companies like Checkpoint, no other company that I know of is as fast with their response time to AI determined threats. Within 3, 4, 5 seconds, the updates are sent throughout the entire environment. So it's one thing to have, we like to brag about how we have 80 different engines looking at threats, and we have hundreds of thousands of collection points, and 44 of those engines are machine learning and artificial intelligence based. And we've been doing it now for about 12 years. So this is nothing new. This is, most companies, artificial intelligence is still on their PowerPoints. It's not been deployed. It's the new fancy, buzzword. But with Checkpoint, we've been doing it for about 12 years. About 40 of our engines are AI based. But like I said, the most critical part of that is not just spotting the threat and the new threat, but how quickly can you leverage that information and send it out and protect all your customers? So, and that's where Checkpoint really is head and shoulders above everyone else.
And surely what we're needing, Pete, in this modern world of disparate working, lots of different devices, data anywhere, cloud, SaaS, etc., that needs to be delivered in such a way that an individual threat somewhere, it could be the cloud, it could be sitting on your network, it could be sitting within something your email's seen. Artificial intelligence context has got to get to a point where it starts to then update other areas of our infrastructure, so the entire infrastructure gets protected. It's not enough just to have great email security to be able to say we've blocked an attachment. It could be a piece of malware, an executable. It could be an MSF file. That's no longer good enough. That context now needs to be shared centrally with the brains of an organization, so the organization can automatically, through artificial intelligence, make that step to say, this is what it means. If we see this on a firewall, we're going to block it on a firewall. If we also see this, we're going to block it on our WAF, or we can actually block it if we're starting to see that threat hitting some of our Kubernetes clusters or Docker, etc. So that's the world we need to be in, whereby it's not just recognizing or seeing a threat, it's not just then responding to that threat and mitigating, but it's actually sharing that context across everything within the infrastructure. Otherwise, we'll still be left with a weakness, surely.
Well, Deryck, you're absolutely right. And to the whole point of this particular discussion is resilience. So assuming that one of those systems is going to fail, assume that, however much training your end users have, they're going to click on that email. So how resilient is your endpoint system to be, in our case, Harmony, how resilient is that against going out to that website and downloading that malicious code? How resilient and how fast are the firewalls going to be updated and know that domain was registered only 3 days ago? So, absolutely, we need to look at how artificial intelligence updates all those subsystems. But in the context of this conversation, cyber resiliency, we know that subsystems are going to fail. We know that help desks are going to fail in authenticating people. We saw that with MGM. We know that people are going to click on phishing email. We know that 89% of all ransomware starts with a clicked on email. And we know that we're living in a very vulnerable world. Just this year alone, we've had over 250 Microsoft vulnerabilities. We've seen dozens of vulnerabilities within our peers, within security companies, our competition. So how resilient are we if our firewall is our vector? We're seeing the hackers exploit our competition and getting right in. But we have to be resilient. So does that mean we need to have a secondary firewall? And the answer is, if you work in a company that can't be offline, yes is the answer. You need to have a multi-vendor strategy in that case. So cyber resiliency really needs to be the secondary, even more important if you're in that company than just your cyber program.
Pete, you talked about vulnerabilities there. I'll share a link just now with the Five Eyes government advisory that came out just in August. And again, really interesting reading. I encourage everyone to have a look, but it wouldn't surprise you to read within that advisory that in the first half of this year, 16% of incidents to do with vulnerabilities were to do with vulnerabilities from 2022. We're not talking about 0 days or 2023 vulnerabilities. Yeah. They're vulnerabilities from last year that either vendors should be doing better in producing more resilient solutions, or our teams should be better at patching them. It's got to be probably both.
Well, it's both, but that's a big embarrassment when you fall victim to a very old vulnerability. That's embarrassing in two ways. Number one, it should have been prioritized to be patched, but number two, there should have been a compensating control in place. In all the programs that I've run, we've known that patching is very, very difficult, especially legacy systems, especially operating systems that can't be modified. If you're in a healthcare situation that have FDA equipment, updating those and patching those is extremely difficult because the FDA requirements. So there's a lot of pushback and costs and teeth gnashing and hand wringing when it comes to patching. But for those things that can't be patched, you have to have a compensating control, and it has to map exactly to that vulnerability. And once again, this brings us right back to cyber resiliency. We know we're going to be breached, but if we have, for example, segmentation, and we have those vulnerable systems on a separate segment that has that compensating control and inspection in an IPS, an intrusion prevention system, that's going to block that that targeted system against your, Microsoft NT 4.0 that you can't patch, right? But and know that it's not going to spread beyond there. So once again, this all comes back to cyber resiliency with the knowledge and the understanding that we have to not only harden our systems, but make them resilient when that hardening does fail, or lack of hardening, as you're pointing out with the Five Eyes report and the older vulnerabilities. It's one thing to get whacked by a 0-day that there is no known patch for. And that's where cyber resiliency really needs to come into play. But being whacked by a vulnerability from 2022 or older, that's not that's not playing ball the right way. That's you've made multiple mistakes with your patching regimen and with your compensating control regimen.
Yeah, or a good compensating control, Pete, would be some of the little guard dogs that run about when I'm recording these things and bark when intruders come to the door. You can have some of these compensating controls as well. Pete, I was going to finish up with talking about leadership resilience and resilience of our teams as well, because I don't think we focus enough on that at all. And I was keen to leave that as the last messaging, because it's got to be one of the most important things that we actually do. By talking about what I'm talking about is I'm talking about leadership from the CISO. So that could be to do with burnout, stress. It could be a life-work balance. It could be running 100 miles an hour. As we both know, the CISOs that always go 100 miles an hour, they're the ones that probably have got issues and they're not getting on top of them. The CISOs I tend to speak to and see that, having that nice conversation with the nice calm IoT, they're the ones that you just know are on top of their program, managing their risks, etc. But we've also got that skill shortage as well. So if we don't have resilience within our teams, our security teams, our operational teams, our security architects, we're not going to be resilient, just like if we don't have resilience in our engineering and our networks and our infrastructure. That's surely equally as important, if not even more important.
I would agree. I'd say it's even more important, because your security teams, you're depending on them to be able to have the capacity to handle an incident in addition to their normal tasks. So, one of the things, and I even wrote it in a book, First 90 Days as a CISO. One of the things that I've always done is I've always been a very, very hands-on CISO and sat with my team and watched them work. And if they were at capacity and their hair was always on fire, that was a red flag. That was a huge issue that meant that, we were understaffed, or we didn't have enough training, or our tools weren't working efficiently together. There was absolutely some red flags. So if your teams are running at capacity and can't take a coffee break and there's complaints when one person takes vacation, those are all red flags that you do not have a cyber resilient staff. And if you do have an incident, all of those normal tasks are going to be, put aside, and you're going to shift your energies towards dealing with the attacker. And that's never a good thing either. So whether it be excessive false positives, or, as I mentioned, inefficient team or tool integration, a lot of those things need to be looked at. And once again, those tabletop exercises, the MITRE self-assessment tools, they will look at those staffing levels and your staffing capacity. And once again, Deryck, you really bring it to a point. If your staff is at 90, 100% operations, that's not a good thing. You really have to have your staff be able to take some chamomile tea and be able to, people should be rotating through and looking at other job functions. There should be cross-training occurring. There should be vacations. There should be time off. There should be time off for certification and training. So all of those things need to be built into your cyber resiliency program. Otherwise, you're going to be a statistic And as you know, here at Checkpoint, we don't want statistics. We want to prevent those types. So if you'd like, one of the other action items that we do have is workshops based on cyber resiliency, based on these frameworks. So you can always reach out to Checkpoint and we will help you make these stages, whether it's stepping along on zero trust or making sure your cloud has capacity or making sure that your staff's tools work in an optimized fashion. All those things, you know, Checkpoint can help out at.
Fantastic. And also that leadership resilience, Pete, it's knowing that when the worst does happen, because as you said right at the start, it probably will, you need to be prepared for it as well. The buck shouldn't just stop with the CISO. That CISO needs to know that there's a resilient boardroom there as well. The boardroom are able to take off some of that load, perhaps through the tabletop exercises, you discuss some of the scenarios, so that the governance is in place as well, so the CISO can get space to go and do what he's best at, which at this point will be tackling that incident to make the organization more resilient, rather than doing a lot of firefighting, which is what we see in the industry.
Yeah, and Deryck, if the board is not bringing up cyber resilience as a topic, as a CISO and as a leader, you need to bring that up as a topic and get everybody up to that level. So I've had many board discussions where, you know, cybersecurity was just an afterthought and really wasn't baked into the DNA of the company. And once a mature CISO brings up these issues and shows what the risks are and shows, you know, how to deal with these risks and how to have a program that gets better over time, you know, that's when the leaders in the board and the other executive teams will appreciate the CISO helping the company, you know, make sure it hits its goals, its growth goals, its operational goals, protecting its, you know, proprietary property and protecting its customers. You know, like I said, if the board is not bringing this up, us as security professionals need to, and we've got a lot of great background that we can bring in with these frameworks and tests and engage the board in these quarterly tests, make sure they see what these tests and these tabletop exercises look like. And if they don't believe the CISO, that's when you need to bring in the third-party consultants, because as I've said a little bit earlier, sometimes it takes an expensive engagement to a third party to validate everything the CISO says, and then the board will go, okay, yeah, I guess we ought to take what the CISO said and have some action on it.
Fantastic. Pete, we're going to call that a wrap at the moment. Can I just say thank you very much for coming on, sharing so much of your insight and knowledge from your career latterly at Checkpoint, but also way before that. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing from you and taking part. The next CISO Connections, we will start to plan. We'll release the dates for that shortly. Hopefully we might be able to do something around artificial intelligence. I was quite taken by some of the stuff you were talking about there, Pete, and perhaps even bring you on to show some of the work that you've been doing, looking at some of the deep fake, the exact threats that are out there, how we can counter that. But thank you once again. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar.
Thank you, Deryck. Appreciate being here.